all of us can agree that waiting on the Lord and waiting on his timing to come to pass is something that we're going to experience in this Christian walk. And what's really important during the waiting season and these waiting periods is how we wait. Hello everyone, welcome back or welcome to my channel. My name is Melody and I make faith-based content here on YouTube. I post new videos every single Monday, so if that is something you're interested in, definitely be sure and subscribe. I would love to have you join the family. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about navigating our waiting season. I know that all of us are waiting on God for at least one thing this very moment, and likely the thing that I'm waiting on God for is something different than what you are waiting on God for, and it's different from what your cousin is waiting on God for, and it's different from what your dad is waiting on God for. But all of us can agree that waiting on the Lord and waiting on his timing to come to pass is something that we're going to experience in this Christian walk. And what's really important during the waiting season and these waiting periods is how we wait. There is this verse in Genesis and it really shows how the enemy tries to seep into our minds during this time. So the enemy, the serpent, approached Eve in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis, and he doesn't outright tell Eve that what she knows God says is a lie, as in don't eat from this tree. He just asks her a question. He asks, are you sure that's what God said? And oftentimes as we are navigating this waiting season and these periods of waiting, that same question and that same doubt can start to seep into our minds, our hearts, and start to take root. And so these are 3 promises coming straight from the Bible that we can hold on to on top of those individual promises that the Lord has made us. And this can help us, 1, guard our hearts and to know that not only is God with us during this time, but he is truly working it all together for our good, the wait included. Now, before we hop into it, I want to go ahead and thank the sponsor of today's video, Mr. Pen. So when it comes to putting together videos like this, as well as honestly all the other content on my channel, it comes with a lot of Bible studying, and I love Mr. Pen, and this is not the first time I'm working with them, so I'm truly honored that I get to share them with you in this video as well. So they are a Christian company and they create Bible studying tools. So think highlighters, pens, markers, crayons, literally anything that you would need to write in your Bible and to make that Bible studying time more fun, more cute, and really just more impactful. They have you covered. All of their products are incredibly affordable and they are so aesthetic. Like, do you see these highlighter pack colors? I personally love the thoughtful approach that they created all of their products in mind specifically for studying the Bible. So none of their pens, markers, crayons, highlighters, nothing is going to bleed through those super thin pages of the Bible. And they also have fine tip points. So you can highlight just the word or just the verse and not everything else on the page. If you know, you know. So I'm gonna have a link in the description box for you to check out all of my Mr. Pen favorites. And I also have a code for you guys. If you use Melody Alisa, that is going to get you 10% off your order. So thank you again to Mr. Pen for making my personal Bible study time more fun. And I definitely encourage you guys to check them out. All right, now with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into our 3 promises from God that we can hold on to during our waiting season. So promise number 1 on our list today, the very first promise from God that we can hold on to during our waiting season, is to know that God will do what he said he will do regardless of how impossible it may seem. Now I'm gonna need you to just go ahead and pause right here, do a little deep breath in and out, and say that one again with me. God will do what he said he will do regardless of how impossible it seems. Now when it comes to a promise like this one specifically is coming from the Old Testament, although we can see this time and time again throughout the word. But specifically, I feel like it's important to start with that first promise that God made to Abraham. So Abraham, at the ripe old age of 75, was promised that him and his wife, who was 10 years younger than him, would conceive a child, and this son would be named Isaac. Now it took them 25 years for this promise to come to pass. So Abraham, did not have his son till he was almost 100 years old, and his wife was 90. So even back then, that was some seemingly impossible stuff. I mean, today even that would be unheard of. But that is the type of God that we serve. So just like he kept this promise to Abraham, despite the time that it took, despite his timing not aligning with their timing, which it didn't. Sarah at a certain point throughout this waiting process got impatient, decided that she was going to craft a plan of her own to conceive this child, and ended up just creating a little bit of a mess for herself, which we actually are going to get to later on in these list of promises. But nonetheless, God still honored this promise that he made to both Sarah and Abraham. And that is just a testament and a testimony to God being a promise keeper, no matter how impossible it may seem. So there's a specific verse from Genesis I want us to just go ahead and read together, where God even acknowledges that this seems a little bit impossible, but still encourages Abraham to hold on tight to this promise. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop it up on the screen for us to read it together. It is Genesis chapter 18, verses 14. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. I feel like this is just beautiful. Like I mentioned, God is pointing out to Abraham that even though this seems impossible, that there is nothing too hard for God. And this applies to us wherever we are in our waiting season, whatever that thing is that we're waiting on God for, whether it seems impossible or not, we can know that God is going to do what he said he is going to do. So that is going to be promise number 1. So promise number 2 on our list today, the second promise from God that we can hold on to during our waiting season, is to know that God will provide for us even when we sin. Now, we don't want to hear this promise and then use it as a license to go out and do whatever we want or to sin. But during the waiting season and during that period of really just waiting on God for something, this is a time where we often can get impatient, and that impatience can cause us to sin. So it's important for us to know, especially as we are waiting on God for something, that we don't have to wait perfectly for God to provide for us and for God to fulfill his promises. Perfection is not a prerequisite for God fulfilling his promises or for God loving us, choosing us, and providing for us. The only person who has ever walked this planet who was perfect is Jesus. And while we need to aim to be Christ-like, we are always going to fall short of the glory of God because of our simple human nature. And I feel like there is one group of people in the Bible that really demonstrate this promise and have lived through this promise time and time again, and that is the Israelites. Moses frees the Israelites from slavery, from captivity, and he brings them into what he thinks is the promised land. Fortunately, because the Israelites disobey God and all the instructions that the Lord is giving Moses to give to the Israelites time and time again, the Israelites end up wandering through the desert for 40 years. So this isn't to say that there are not consequences for our sin, but just because we sin, that does not mean that it cancels us out from receiving God's provision. So here in Exodus chapter 16, I'm kind of going to break down this story, and I feel like it just highlights the fact that God still chose to provide for the Israelites despite them literally disobeying his instructions time and time again. So God is providing for the Israelites in chapter 16, and he is giving Moses instructions to tell the Israelites that every single morning you need to go out into the wilderness and collect this food that I am dropping down from heaven. They ultimately decided to call this food manna. And on the 7th day, this is when the Israelites were to observe the Sabbath. So they should not go out and collect food on the 7th day, but the Israelites still did. They also did not collect a double portion on the 6th day like the Lord instructed, to hold them over on the Sabbath so they didn't have to go out and collect food. And so time and time again, Moses goes back to the Israelites and says, hey, I literally told you don't do that. Why are you doing this? And time again, God still chooses to provide food for them. And this is something that God did for 40 years. He provided manna from heaven to the Israelites for 40 years, despite their disobedience, despite their sinful nature, and despite their sin in general. So I want to read just one of these verses, actually 2 of these verses. We're gonna kind of hop around in Exodus chapter 16, but I feel like it's important for us to really grasp this concept in our hearts. Our imperfections are not going to cancel us out from God fulfilling his promises, but there are still consequences for our sins. And then down in verse 35, it says, the Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they reached the border of the land of Canaan. So I personally love what these Bible verses highlight, and also the question that Moses asked the Israelites, like, please people, how long will you not obey what the Lord is saying? And so I hope that we can learn here from the Israelites to not disobey what God is telling us to do during this waiting period, and to also know that even when we do falter, he will still provide for us. So that is going to be promise number 2. So number 3 on our list today, our third and final promise from God that we can hold on to during our season of waiting, is to know that God is a God who sees us. And even more than that, during the season of waiting and during our potential suffering, he is a God who also will allow himself to be seen. Now, when I say that, you might be thinking like, okay, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And so I really want to point us to the story of Hagar. So here we're going back to the book of Genesis. And like I mentioned with promise number 1, God made a promise to Abraham and his wife, Sarah, that they were going to have a child. But during this 25-year wait, Sarah got impatient. With her impatience, she crafted this plan for them to have a child through one of her slaves named Hagar. So here, Hagar goes through unimaginable pain, not only having to have this child that she didn't necessarily sign up to have, she's having Abraham's child, Sarah's husband's child. She also is now being treated very harshly by Sarah, this woman who crafted the plan to begin with. And so in her just suffering, she runs off into the desert, and is there when she runs off into the desert that God meets her. And not only does God meet her in the desert and allow himself to be seen by her, God also lets her know that I've seen you. I have seen your suffering. And so this is a promise that we too can hold on to, that even though we may go through the trials and the tribulations, and honestly, just trying to be steadfast and holding on to the promises that God gives us during the waiting period, or just waiting to get out on the other side of something, God sees us during this time. We are not alone. God sees our suffering. He cares about our suffering. And if we really look around us and look at our circumstances and look at these different pockets of our life, if we look hard enough, we are also going to see God. We're going to see God's provision here. We're going to see God through that kind statement or that kind gesture over here. We're going to see God when we open up our Bible and we randomly come to this verse that really encourages us. We are going to see God through this time when we look for him. So I want to go ahead and pop up one of these verses from chapter 16, where Hagar lets it be known and says to God, "You are a God who sees me." So let's go ahead and read this verse together. So the verse is Genesis chapter 16, verses 13. And it says, "So she named the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are El Roi.' For she said, 'In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me.'" I feel like this verse is really beautiful, and it just highlights that God truly is El Roi. He is the one who sees us. And just as much as he sees us, he also will allow himself to be seen. And so this is the third and final truth and promise from God that we can hold on to during our waiting season. All right, guys, that is going to be it for me. These are 3 promises from God that we can hold on to in our waiting. I want to go ahead and thank Mr. Penn one more time for sponsoring today's video. Thank you so much. And now, of course, it is your turn. So in the comments below, I would love to know, what is one thing that you are waiting on God for? Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I guarantee that all of us are waiting on God for something. And so please take a second, drop your response down below. I'm going to, and you never know who you could be encouraging, because sometimes the very thing that we see other people waiting for are something that God has already shown up and done in our lives. And it's by us sharing our testimonies and saying, "Oh sis, you're waiting on God for this. Let me tell you what he's done for me," that it can truly be another source of encouragement for us in this waiting season. So again, definitely take a second, drop your response down below, take a scroll on through, get to inspiring and encouraging some of your sisters, and I will see you guys in my next video. I love you.